All right, we can get started. So hello, everyone, and welcome to our intro session today on the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative for Malawi. This is co-hosted by Malawi Civil Society Network on Climate Change, CISONECC, the Coordination Union for the Rehabilitation of the Environment, CURE, Trócaire, and the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. So we're super excited to have all of you with us today. We'd love if you could introduce yourselves in the chat, where you're joining us from, and the organization, collective, or movement that you're part of. And just a reminder that we are recording the session today to be able to share with the folks that couldn't join. My name is Sabla, and I'm the head of Africa Campaigns and Advocacy at the Fossil Fuel Treaty Initiative, and I'm based in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. And I'll be facilitating the session with all of you today. We're super lucky to be joined with an amazing group of panelists and key players in the environmental and climate justice space in Malawi and across Africa, who are fighting for fossil fuel phase out and equitable renewable energy deployment for universal electricity access, climate resilience, and energy sovereignty. So today we're going to deep dive into the Fossil Fuel Treaty Initiative. It's a big and a bold proposal for a fair and financed transition from fossil fuel dependency to a justice-based renewable future. And you're going to hear from voices across Malawi and Africa on why the energy transition from coal, oil, and gas dependency to a prosperous renewable future is so essential for our continent. Across Malawi, as in many African countries, you're grappling with low energy access while facing the wreckage of a fossil-fueled climate crisis that you did not cause. So there's cyclones, there's floods, there's droughts, and enough is enough. So the Fossil Fuel Treaty calls to hold the fossil fuel industry accountable, ending the expansion of coal, oil, and gas, and facilitating a fair and funded transition to a prosperous renewable future that can provide energy access for all. There's momentum around the world that's building every day for a fossil fuel treaty with support from over 1 million people, thousands of organizations, many of you are also among those organizations, hundreds of cities and subnational governments, and 16 nation states from the global south. And it's time for Malawi to join too. We've seen the powerful leadership of Malawi as the current chair of the Least Developed Countries Group on climate change. And Malawi's leadership on the Fossil Fuel Treaty Initiative holds the potential to create a really positive ripple effect across the bloc's 45 countries in Africa, Asia, the Pacific, and the Caribbean, catalyzing just transitions around the world. So I'm now going to take a moment to introduce you to our incredible panelists, and then we can get started. Please feel free throughout the session to put any questions that come up directly in the chat, and we're also going to open up space for a Q&A at the end. And today we're really lucky to have an incredible group of speakers with us. We have Herbert Mwalukomo, who's the Executive Director of the Center for Environmental Policy and Advocacy, CEPA. We have Julius Ngoma, who's the National Coordinator for CISONECC, the Civil Society Network on Climate Change. We have Charles Mkoka, who's the Executive Director for the Coordination Union for the Rehabilitation of the Environment, CURE. We have Violet Mfunebanda, who is a youth environment and climate activist. We have Matthews Malata, an environmental sustainability champion for the Malawi National Planning Commission. We have Dr. Amira Sawas, who is the head of research and policy at the Fossil Fuel Treaty Initiative. We have Omar El-Mawi from the Africa Movement Building Space at PowerShift Africa. And last but not least, we have Lorraine Chiponda, who is the Africa Network Coordinator for the Global Gas and Oil Network. So I want to say a big, massive thank you to all of our speakers for being here, and to all of you who are joining us for the session today. We're really grateful. So we're going to get started now after the big round of introductions, and we're going to begin with Herbert Mwalukomo, who is the Executive Director for the Center for Environmental Policy and Advocacy, CEPA, a think tank on climate change, natural resources, and biodiversity in Malawi. Herbert has over 20 years experience in environmental policy research and advocacy. He's led a number of advocacy initiatives on climate change while working as the national coordinator for CISONECC in Malawi, as the Africa Regional Facilitator for the Southern Voices on Climate Change, which is a coalition of climate policy networks in the Global South, and in his current role as the Executive Director of CEPA. Herbert is involved in mentoring and equipping others with skills for developing climate adaptation innovations, and he holds an MSc in Geography and Environmental Studies from the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg. Herbert is now going to situate the energy climate crisis in Malawi and the need for a just transition. So over to you, Herbert.
Thank you so much, Sebo. I wish I could show my face, but I would not be able to do so for long because of internet connection where I am. So once again, welcome to all participants to this interesting discussion. It could not have been more timely than now. So as the introducer, I will be situating the energy climate crisis in Malawi, and of course also laying the ground for why we have to talk about just transition in the context of the fossil fuel treaty. So just as a guide in terms of my talking points, I will be answering questions of what is the energy situation in Malawi and the link with climate change, and also what does just transition look like in Malawi, and also why the fossil treaty is relevant to the context of Malawi. So to start with, as Malawian participants would appreciate, we are an energy poor society. 23% of the Malawian population has access to electricity, and that means close to 80% don't. And because of that, over 97% of the population relies on charcoal and firewood. Household cooking and heating. Right now, as we speak, 76% plus of urban households are using charcoal as a primary source of energy. And most of it is basically unsustainable charcoal. And that leads to high rates of deforestation. And by the way, the numbers are increasing. Because of the high rates of deforestation events, as you know, in Malawi, we've been experiencing cyclones time and again, and such impacts like excessive rains, which cause flooding, are difficult to cope with when we have high rates of deforestation, and because then you have a lot of flooding that does take place, and that leads to crop failure and loss of livelihoods. And then it becomes a cyclical challenge. We also know that in that context, then what we need is to increase access to alternative energy sources so that we can address the challenges of deforestation, which would help us to deal with some of the impacts of climate change that we see now that could not have been as much if we had a highly vegetated country. So that is in the context of access to energy. If we are talking about the global context, as we all know, at the global level, energy is one of the responsible sectors for emissions that are responsible for climate change. And when the world is talking about just transition, for example, it is basically in the context of energy moving away from fossil fuels. And the transformation of energy systems away from fossil fuels is what the world is considering when we are talking about just transition, to say that we should not leave people behind, especially those who are dependent on those industries. Not so much the case for Malawi, because the access that we talked about in terms of electricity access is not that it is fossil fuel dependent. We still are depending on hydro as the primary source of energy. So in that sense, our energy is kind of clean, small as it is. However, the trajectory is not the same, because if you look at the emissions trajectory, you look at our NDC, our nationally determined contribution, at the moment it puts our emissions from the energy sector at a very, very low rate of about 6%. But by 2040, we are told that we will be at 39%, which is almost 40% as emissions from the sector. And why is that the case? It's because of our development pathway. We have Malawi 2063 that requires to be powered by energy sources, not from sustainable sources, as it were, not from renewable energy only, but largely from sources like coal. And because the Malawi 2063 talks about industrializing the country. And for us to reach those goals that we have in our blueprint, it means we need to invest in energy sources that are more than the hydro that we usually have or that we currently have as our primary source of energy. And so that is why we are seeing the trajectory of energy consumption from fossil fuels in Malawi rising according to our own NDC. So the industrialization drive is envisaged to create more jobs, and that is what is promised, and that's why we still are able to plan in that way, because we think we need that energy for us to develop the way we would like to develop. Now, as I mentioned, just transition is about leaving no one behind, and while in the global north, when we are talking about just transition, it's generally applicable to carbon-intensive economies. However, this discussion is emerging or gaining equal importance in developing countries because it provides a framework for ensuring that national responses to climate change do not create inequalities through exacerbating vulnerabilities to those who are most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And that's why the concept tries to address the dual crisis of both climate change and inequality. So some of the principles about this concept is that regardless of context, whatever happens, we should actively encourage decarbonization. Just because we are in the global south, just because we are not contributing much to emissions that cause climate change, it doesn't mean that we should invest more in carbon emitting sources of energy, because then we are repeating the same mistakes that were made in the past. So if we are committed to just transition, we should still do our best to avoid going the fossil fuel development pathway. We should also, according to the just transition concept, it means also that affected regions must be supported so that we are able to address inequalities that exist in addressing climate change issues. So in that case, in terms of Malawi, what it means is that number one, we have to expand energy options for all, especially for urban dwellers where we are the highest consumers of unsustainable charcoal as a primary source of energy. And also it means we have to rethink our development pathway for powering industrialization that we desire, according to Malawi 2063. At the same time, we need provision of climate finance by developed countries to support investments in renewable energy technologies. This must be done in line with the principles of the Climate Convention. And I'm referring in particular to the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. Because sometimes it looks like we have to beg, when in fact the Climate Convention is very clear about obligations on who should provide what support for us to move away or to mitigate the impacts of climate change, and also address the impacts through adaptation. So addressing the root cause of climate change in that sense, which would require moving away from fossil fuels ultimately as the ultimate solution. And I must say I'm a strong believer in that we cannot talk about addressing the impacts or indeed mitigating climate change through most of the propositions that are currently on the table, except we deal with the root cause, which is fossil fuels. And that's why going for low carbon development in Malawi will give us the moral standing to call for a treaty on non-proliferation of fossil fuels. If we are going to repeat the same mistakes, it will be difficult for us to call for those that are continuing to use or to extract fossil fuels for their development, because we are also doing the same mistakes. So yes, we need to talk about justice, but that justice also means that we have to lead by example. And so as Malawi, we need to do our part. But at the same time, there is need for global cooperation, which is required. Close the tap on fossil fuels in the first place, or other options for dealing with the climate crisis. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Herbert, for your intervention. I think it was really helpful in situating us within the context of Malawi and the energy access needs and how the industrialization pathway holds the potential to facilitate an energy transition that can boost energy access and adaptive capacity if we rely on the abundant potential of renewable energy and not by following a fossil fuel development pathway, but that to get there, climate finance is essential and that polluters must pay. So thank you so much for situating us in that context. I'm now going to turn to Julius Ngoma, who is the National Coordinator for the Civil Society Network on Climate Change, CISONECC. and he's also the designated national platform coordinator and thematic lead for adaptation and loss and damage for PACSA, the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance. He has served as an alternate active observer to the Green Climate Fund, representing CSOs in the Global South. He's a member of the Continental Governing Council for PACSA and part of the political and technical affairs for PACSA. He's also a focal person for the Southern Voices on Adaptation Network in Malawi and a focal person for the African Coalition for Sustainable Energy and Access in Southern Africa. So he's basically everywhere. He holds an MSc in Environmental Sciences from the University of Malawi and a Bachelor of Science in Forestry from Mzuzu University in Malawi. And he's currently pursuing a PhD in Forestry and Environmental Management with Mzuzu University. So Julius will speak to the efforts in Malawi to address the climate crisis and promote resilience, energy access, and just transitions, including via the LDC leadership, the Global Shield, and the multi-stakeholder platform. So over to you, Julius, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Sebo, and thank you all for joining. Also to say that my internet might not help me enough to be seen, but I think I will try to speak as much as possible to the topic I was given. But I know my senior Herbert has already started talking about some of the issues, so I think I'll just build on what Herbert actually presented from the perspective and the context of Malawi. So I think I was asked to reflect on the issue of the response, the national response to the climate crisis, but also looking at what has transpired so far in terms of maybe the policy and then the institutions and so on. And perhaps I'll also be reflecting on what are the gaps when it comes to the response to the climate crisis. So we all know that almost all the countries signed up for the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change somewhere back in 1994. And with this, each country, including Malawi, was obligated to be to put up national response to climate change crisis. So a number of frameworks have been developed over the years, frameworks that are dealing with the issue of adaptation, mitigation, and recently we've seen countries also going in the direction of advancing frameworks that are dealing with the issue of loss and damage. And we all know that there was a Kyoto Protocol, which was also a treaty that was signed by a number of countries, except a few countries that have not that were not signed up to it, like the US and others. But as a country, Malawi had to also develop policies that are in line with the Kyoto Protocol. We've seen the numbers coming out from this, and then these are nationally appropriate mitigation actions. And also the government also went into the process of developing NAPAs, which are national adaptation programs of action. And we've also seen the government of Malawi going into different initiatives, including those that were assisting us to mitigate, but also reduce the carbon emissions that the country contributes to the atmosphere. So there were some joint implementation mechanisms that the government of Malawi went into, including green development mechanisms that also now recently we are talking about the market mechanisms under the Article 6 of the Paris Agreement to try and ensure that we mitigate reduce the emissions, but also act on the mitigation work. But even though we're talking about this, remember Herbert talked about the amount of greenhouse gases that as a country we are emitting into the atmosphere. But that doesn't really give us a picture right now. As we said, cumulatively, as we move ahead with the years, we are going to be, emitting a lot of greenhouse gases, which needs to be dealt with. But we've also seen recently that the government, apart from working on the Kyoto Protocol, they are also working on initiatives and that policy frameworks and initiatives that are under the Paris Agreement. So we've seen the NDCs. Hilbert talked about NDCs and how they are being framed and what are the inspirations from Malawi. And with that, a number of policies have also been initiated. We have the climate change policy in Malawi that is dealing with the issue of climate change, but also looking at how best we want to adapt. Let me just say that the number of the policies that I'm going to mention here, the focus has always been on how the country can adapt to the impacts of climate change, because we have the sense that maybe in one or the other, we're not obligated or we're not supposed to be in the forefront to be maybe acting a lot on mitigation. But the impacts are here with us, and they are going to be with us for the next couple of decades, and we need to still find our way or we need to make sure that we actually act on it. So we have the NAPS, which is being developed as a framework, but is purely focusing on adaptation. We have the climate change policy, which has also a bias on adaptation. We know we have mitigation related interventions in there, but much of the energies are focusing on how do we build resilience and how do we build how do we ensure that the communities are adapting to the impacts of climate change. So we have I talked about the NAMAs, which are nationally appropriate mitigation actions. These were prepared, but not fully implemented, and they were taken over by the work or by the NDCs when they were being developed in 2015. But also we've seen the government working on the energy policies and acts. We've seen some progressive policies in the energy sector. I'm saying progressive because we have actually seen that for the last couple of years, energy. I mean, the government also has been focusing on developing a renewable energy strategy, which also is answering the question where Malawi is actually thinking of going ahead of everything else that we're talking about in terms of reducing emissions, and that is coupled with other strategies as well. The National Resilience Strategy, we have the Chaco strategy. All these are speaking to how the government wants to actually deal with the issue. And the number of institutions, of course, have been developed over the years. Currently, the Environmental Affairs Department is acting on all these policies that I mentioned, particularly most of these policies that I mentioned. And the only department that is also there to support, particularly on the reducing of emissions, is the Minister of Energy, which has also been very supportive in terms of ensuring that there are several multi-stakeholder platforms that are being developed and different initiatives and that are also being prepared to be implemented in the country. We've seen multi-stakeholder platforms being also created as a matter of ensuring that we add our voices in terms of how we want to move with the issue of renewable energy, but also ensuring that we're reducing emissions. We have, at national level, we've had several campaigns that have, dealt with the issue of, clean and renewable energy, but also divestment from the fossil fuel, activities. We have had to implement the Big Shift campaign in Malawi. This was actually also being supported by the Minister of Energy, where we're actually focusing on ensuring that the country, the government, plus other players such as the World Bank, African Development Bank, and other investors are divesting away from fossil fuels. And I think we were a bit successful at that, because at that moment we had the government was actually in the plan, had a very huge plan for coming up with a coal-fired power plant, which actually resulted into some of these initiatives being halted, and that's thanks to some of these initiatives. And currently, we've also seen other multi-stakeholder platforms in implementing different initiatives that are supporting the government not to go the way of increasing the emissions. So, for example, we have a peace project with a number of institutions that are part of this, SEPA itself. We have Oxfam, CISONECC, and other players, and there are other multi-stakeholder, multi-stakeholder institutions that are also part and parcel of this. So, in a nutshell, what I was saying was, I think there's efforts are there. We're trying to build resilience. We're trying to build adaptation potential. We are also trying to ensure that we are aligning ourselves with the existing international frameworks so that we're able to reduce the emissions at our level. But that's not enough. I think we need more efforts to be put in place to ensure that we support the government of Malawi to find out or to develop other strategies that can help us to reduce the emissions, and even being part of this initiative is also one of the answers that we are looking forward to. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Julius, for your intervention, for highlighting all the important work that Malawi is doing in the policy landscape, rightly so, in adaptation and resilience, and also developing policies on renewable energy strategies, and also the people power, such as the Big Shifts campaign that was able to halt the development of a coal power plant. And just knowing how many of you in this Zoom room today have been a part of this positive change. So thank you so much. I'm now going to give a really brief introduction on the proposed fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty and the importance of the initiative for Malawi and for our continent. I don't know if Zoe, you're still able to share. Oh, perfect. Okay, great. So I will just now jump into what is the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. So the proposed fossil fuel treaty is both a campaign and a diplomatic initiative to address a major policy void on the main cause of climate breakdown, which is coal, oil, and gas extraction, and deliver a fair and financed transition from fossil fuels to an equitable, renewable future while complementing the goals of the Paris Agreement. So you can see on this graph that the world is currently on track to extract 110% more coal, oil, and gas by 2030 compared to our climate targets. And this is because climate policies have predominantly focused on limiting demand for fossil fuels and limiting emissions while allowing fossil fuel extraction to grow. And so the result is the scenario we find ourselves in today with a dangerous overshoot of fossil fuel extraction. So the proposed fossil fuel treaty aims to rein this in with equitable fossil fuel phase out that delivers on a just transition. On the next slide, please. So the unchecked expansion of fossil fuels globally is driving our climate to collapse, and that's a reality that is dangerously present across Malawi and many countries of the region, from cyclones, floods, and droughts that are uprooting communities, ecosystems, and livelihoods in a really violent way. So global fossil fuel extraction is actually responsible for nearly 90% of all carbon emissions that have been released in the last decade, and we know that this cannot continue to grow unchecked. Next slide, please. If we look at our continent on fossil fuels, you can see on the map how much the continent has been carved up for coal mines, for oil pipelines, for gas flares and terminals. And we are essentially, as Africa, being used as the gas station of foreign companies, with 60% of the fossil fuel companies operating on the continent headquartered outside of Africa. So you can think of Shell, BP, Eni, Total, many of these companies driving a neo-colonial scramble for our resources. And the majority of these fossil fuels are actually destined for export and not to satisfy domestic energy demand. So for example, in the case of gas extraction, this is more than 90% is destined for export. And the vast majority, so more than 70% of these oil and gas projects are at risk of becoming stranded assets, so sinking public money into infrastructure that pollutes and drives violence in our communities while never delivering its promised return on investment. And in the case of the G20, there's 4 times more finance that's going to fossil fuels on the continent than to renewable energy. And the next slide, please. So if we think about what has this fossil fuel landscape translated to for our continent in terms of energy access, it hasn't. We have over 80% of the world's unelectrified population is in Africa, making our continent a global energy poverty hotspot. We've seen decades of fossil fuel extraction on our continent that have left 600 million Africans in the dark, and this rate is only on the rise. And even if we look at powerhouses on the continent in terms of fossil fuel extraction, like Angola and Nigeria, these countries still struggle with energy access. So Nigeria has over 85 million people living in the dark, and that amounts to one of the biggest energy access deficits in the world. Angola has more than half of its population in energy poverty. So the pursuit of universal energy access following a fossil fuel model has not delivered for our continent. We're actually the only region on Earth where the population living without electricity has grown since the turn of the millennium. And we have nearly 1 billion people inhaling toxic fumes every single day from a lack of clean cooking. This is driving climate breakdown, energy poverty, violence, and debt cycles. So it's really clear that the fossil fuel era has failed us. On the next slide, please. Despite the expansion and falling prices of renewable energy, we've seen that fossil fuels have actually kept the lion's share of the global energy matrix over the last decade and a half. And this is because leaving the energy transition to the market alone is not enough. We need strong international cooperation and solidarity mechanisms to ensure that there is an equitable phase out of fossil fuel extraction and finance for a just transition. Next slide, please. Because the truth is that Africa is sitting atop the largest renewable energy potential on Earth. We are home to 39% of the world's current wind power potential, 39% of the world's renewable energy potential and 60% of the world's best solar resources. And the current wind power potential of the continent could satisfy Africa's energy needs 250 times over. And despite holding the biggest potential on Earth, you can see the potential covering the African continent with the yellow circle as compared to the blue, which is the projected demand. Despite having the lion's share of this renewable energy potential, Africa has only received 2% of renewable energy investments in the last 2 decades. So we need a change of course to harness this potential more than ever. On the next slide, don't worry, it's not as scary as it looks. There are countries, basically what this shows is there are countries across our continent with very low GDPs per capita, which you can see along the x-axis, the horizontal line, who are highly dependent on oil for their national revenue. And this is as an example, but you could look at gas, you could look at coal, you could look at dependency on job creation, on energy supply. So here you can just see the level of dependency, countries like Chad, Nigeria, Angola, Algeria, Congo, who have ranging between 20 to 60% of their national economies coming from oil revenue, who without international support or cooperation will not be able to transition. And then we have on the y-axis, on the vertical line, there are countries who are perpetrators of the climate crisis, countries like the UK, Canada, the US, Norway, who have very high GDPs per capita, up to $70,000. Extremely diversified, wealthy economies who have plunged us into this climate crisis. In the theory of change of the Fossil Fuel Treaty Initiative, it's these wealthy nations who are responsible for climate breakdown that need to phase out their fossil fuel extraction first and fastest. And as Herbert was also saying in his initial intervention, fund a transition and technology transfers for the most fossil fuel dependent developing nations, because truly without international cooperation, this transition will not be possible. On the next slide, please. With our allies at the Civil Society Equity Review, we've developed science and equity-based phase-out dates for each fossil fuel for each country, depending on how much the fossil fuel contributes to government revenue, job creation, and energy supply, the economic capacity of each country, and how much they've driven the climate crisis. On the next slide, you can see that there's really clear findings that without international cooperation and support, the phase out of fossil fuel extraction and a transition will not be possible, and that polluters need to pay up. On the next slide, you can see that this urgent need to phase out fossil fuel expansion is not only coming from fringe spaces or environmental spaces. The International Energy Agency, which is the leading kind of energy body and modeler, has said there's no need to continue investment in new fossil fuel supply in our net zero pathway. And on the following slide, you can see that the UN Secretary General has echoed really similar sentiments about continued investment in fossil fuels as a moral and economic madness. So what if there is no global agreement on fossil fuel extraction? That is the world in which we find ourselves today, where every fossil fuel supplier wants to squeeze out the last drop and be the last barrel sold. And the implications are that it stalls the energy transition, as you saw in some of the earlier slides, where fossil fuels still make up around 80% of the global energy matrix and have not been displaced by renewable energy, despite renewable energy expansion and falling prices and being a much cheaper competitor. This leads also to stranded assets. As I said before, more than 70% of projected oil and gas projects on the continent are at risk of becoming stranded assets or lost investments, creates risks to workers and communities with the price volatility and job insecurity, delays the deployment of renewable energy and economic diversification while consolidating dangerous monopolies on fossil fuels, and leads to a really dangerous world of climate breakdown. So on the next slide, we can ask, how do we deal with this crisis? We have the Paris Agreement, which builds really important global consensus on climate change and sets the 1.5-degree target, builds the Loss and Damage Fund, and creates kind of all this essential progress on the climate crisis. On the next slide, you can see there is one really major omission from the Paris Agreement and the UNFCCC, is that there's no mention of coal, oil, or gas in the Paris Agreement, no mention of the leading driver of climate collapse, which is fossil fuels. And so we ask ourselves, how are we actually going to solve a crisis if we don't go to the root? We saw that COP28 was the first time that the need to transition from fossil fuels was ever mentioned, and that took nearly 3 decades. We know that we can't wait another 3 decades to come up with the solution, and that's why we're really putting forward the Fossil Fuel Treaty as a mechanism to fill that policy void and complement the Paris Agreement by tackling the climate crisis at its source. By addressing fossil fuel expansion, we're not only tackling the climate crisis, we're also tackling the plastics crisis, because 99% of plastics comes from fossil fuels, and the fossil fuel industry is increasingly seeing plastics as a lifeline to keep expanding. The next slide, please. So the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty is not yet written. This will be developed by the participating nations, but it is grounded in 3 essential pillars. One is on a just transition, so ensuring there's financing and technology transfers for renewable energy deployment, economic diversification, and alternative development pathways. With a pillar on non-proliferation, so this means no new fossil fuel expansion of coal, oil, or gas anywhere in the world, and a fair phase out, which is following a justice-based model. Existing fossil fuel extraction needs to be phased out in line with our climate targets, with the world's wealthiest nations who put us into this crisis having to phase out first and fastest, while providing both technical and financial support for fossil fuel dependent developing nations to transition at a slower pace. We use the metaphor of fossil fuels as weapons of mass destruction because they are the leading cause of the climate breakdown that we are dealing with today. The next slide, you can see the momentum that's building around the world in support of the Fossil Fuel Treaty from over 4,000 organizations. And I know many of your organizations in Malawi are also part of that growing support. And other organizations, including the World Health Organization and the European Parliament. And if your organization has not yet endorsed the call, we invite you to do so, and we'll share the links for the website where you can. The next slide, please. In addition to all these organizations, there's support from over 130 cities and subnational governments, including Lilongwe and Mzuzu, from more than 1 million individuals, from over 1,000 parliamentarians from 96 countries, from more than 3,000 scientists and academics, and hundreds of faith institutions. So we can see that the support for this proposal is really growing across the world from different voices and spaces. The next slide, please. The proposals also garnered a lot of attention from the media and reaching a lot of the major media outlets around the world. The next slide, please. So the Fossil Fuel Treaty takes inspiration from historic treaties from around the world that were able to tackle threats to humanity, like substances that deplete the ozone layer, chemical weapons, and landmines. And these treaties show how people power, parliamentarians, cities, and small, ambitious coalitions of nations coming together are able to shift entrenched norms and narratives and address and overcome global threats. The next slide, please. So we're in this phase of building the political momentum within the Fossil Fuel Treaty, especially with climate vulnerable nations and progressive governments with policies on keeping fossil fuels in the ground, as well as fossil fuel dependent developing nations who want to transition but need the international support to do so. We are not currently engaging the big polluters at this stage, as we don't want them to derail or dilute the process, and we will have rules for engagement or political declarations for participating nations as we build the pressure for the Fossil Fuel Treaty to become a reality. The next slide, please. So there's now support from 16 Global South nations from the Pacific, South Asia, the Caribbean, and Latin America who are participating in discussions to develop a fossil fuel treaty, and we need to have African countries that come to the table. There's no legal obligations of joining the bloc of nations, and the first countries to join are not the first countries that need to phase out fossil fuels. Instead, the first countries that come to the table get to set the rules and provisions and terms of the treaty to their benefit. And even fossil fuel producers such as Colombia, which is one of the biggest coal exporters in the world, are joining this cohort to end a precarious fossil fuel dependency and diversify their economies as the world transitions. The next slide, please. So as we continue to build the political momentum for our movement, we're at the stage of growing this political buy-in, as I was saying, because there's support from thousands of parliamentarians, hundreds of subnational governments, from nation states, from UN agencies such as the World Health Organization. So we're growing this stage as we seek a negotiating mandate on the Fossil Fuel Treaty, hopefully next year. The next slide. If we think about the importance for Malawi, as many African countries were struggling with low electrification rates and high levels of climate vulnerability that is driven by the fossil fuel crisis, which is growing most fastest in the Western countries. And so Malawi is really up against a climate crisis that it did not cause. Malawi is showing so much powerful climate leadership, such as chairing the LDC group. And we know that the global expansion of fossil fuels is undercutting this great work, and that constraining that global fossil fuel expansion can really help contain the climate breakdown and build more adaptive resilience. The Fossil Fuel Treaty Initiative aims to facilitate technology transfers and also finance for shifting from fossil fuels to renewable energy that can really deliver on energy access. And we have an independent expert group on just transition finance that Amira will touch more on, that addresses issues of debt, fiscal constraints, innovative finance mechanisms, and how to replace fossil fuel revenues. The next slide, please. As I said before, there's 130 subnational governments around the world that have supported the call for the fossil fuel treaty. And there's also many other cities like Freetown, Calcutta, Belém, Lima, and London. So Malawi could become that first African country to join this bloc of 16 nations from the global south and really exemplify its climate leadership and set the terms with this coalition of nations around the rules and provisions that the Fossil Fuel Treaty would entail. And the next slide, please. We are developing constantly a lot of our research around kind of the key needs for countries in the just transition. And some of those are around alleviating debt, which I've seen recently unjustly currently consumes around 98% of Malawi's GDP. So it's looking at how do we address constraints around debt and fiscal space and create new opportunities for finance that the expert working group is currently researching on. And we're also working to develop a just transition investment fund where participating countries can actually submit renewable energy portfolios for investment opportunities. The next slide, please. So here is some of the examples of the research pieces, particularly on debt, tax, and financing for the just transition that the team is working on, that Amira is leading, as well as specific pieces that are most relevant to the African continent. So I know that was a lot, and there'll be lots of space to ask questions. Feel free to add them in the chat also now, and we can try and respond to them as we go. But I'm now going to pass briefly to Dr. Amira Sawas, who's our head of research and policy at the Fossil Fuel Treaty Initiative. She's a feminist researcher and advocate who works at the intersections of climate change, gender justice, public participation, and the social contract. Amira has almost 20 years experience working on these issues across academia, the private sector, think tanks, and NGOs, with her most previous roles at Climate Outreach, ActionAid, and the Grantham Institute for Climate Change at Imperial College. She has a PhD on water, climate change, and human rights in Pakistan, and is a contributing author to the IPCC 6th Assessment Report on Gender and Climate Security. So Amira is going to speak to the pathways for international cooperation on just transition finance as it relates to the Fossil Fuel Treaty Initiative. So I will pass now to you, Amira. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to speak briefly on this. It's a lot of information, so please feel free to reach out anytime if you want more information or a discussion or, questions about what I will share. Next slide, please. So this is just a quick slide on this expert working group on just transition finance. We realize that, this is a very cross-cutting topic and challenge, and therefore we need different lenses, different kinds of expertise related to financing that cut across different parts of the world as well. And so we put together this working group with some really brilliant thinkers, from the legal perspective, from the macroeconomic perspective, the climate justice perspective, and we bring them together to really try and think through where is the latest evidence and what are the kind of potential risks and opportunities that we could be reflecting on, particularly when engaging with governments and civil society. So we can, of course, share more. You can't see the names of the folks on the bottom. It slipped off the slide. Oh, no, it's above the pictures, I can see now. We're also really open to any additional recommendations. So if there's anyone from Malawi, for example, that you think would be helpful to engage with, please do let us know. Next slide, please. Okay, so we looked at the landscape of potential solutions that are being discussed around the just transition, and particularly financing the just transition, because as Seble was describing, and I'm sure you all know very well, there are some systemic barriers that are particularly affecting the African continent, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa as well. So, we know that despite an effort to triple renewable energy investment, for example, only 2% of that globally has gone to the African continent. And then even then, when you look at that, a lot of that has gone to South Africa, for example. So there's a bit of an issue in terms of transition finance. And so we looked at the range of solutions, and there are sort of different solutions being discussed in different forums, but there isn't really anything pulling them all together. So we tried to think about how could a treaty help to actually develop a pathway of financing which overcomes the different barriers in different places. And we learned from this mapping that there's a big piece on debt. We're in the middle of the fourth debt wave. We're basically in another debt crisis. As Seble was saying, public debt in Malawi has risen from 48% of GDP to 93% of GDP in just 4 years. A lot of that, as far as I understand, is driven by disasters and climate impacts. And so it's a big barrier, because it also, on top of swallowing fiscal space, it also makes access to investment very difficult, because the capital costs and the banks' kind of hedging processes become seriously high and prohibitive for countries that are affected by debt. So there's a second area that is around what are the new forms of finance and investment that a treaty could help to draw in to facilitate countries to overcome those barriers. And then the final piece is around, and again, this is relevant for producer states and to some extent consumer states of fossil fuels, how to replace those revenues that are generated at the scale and speed that is required for us to actually transition away from fossil fuels and stave off even worse, disastrous climate change for countries like Malawi and the others who are with us at the moment. But this is a pathway, and it's fundamentally interconnected. So we need solutions along the entire pathway and not just in silos. Next slide, please. So we looked at the proposals that were out there last year. We did a rapid assessment. We have a report on this, so I won't take the time because I want to leave time for questions. But we looked at 3 lenses: the political salience. Are we going to be able to get countries to agree to these mechanisms? How fast can they be implemented to enable that financing to come through? And to what extent do they hold up justice and equity as a central proposition? And so based off of that, we then had a list under each of those 3 areas, which could be negotiated by states who are part of this progressive proposal. Next slide, please. And then we looked, from a legal perspective, as well as a financial perspective, on how a treaty could enable the finance actually practically. And we learned that there are 6 ways that a treaty could enable the financing to actually flow. Firstly, the treaty could raise new funds, particularly from developed countries and corporates and the MDBs, to transfer to developing countries, again in line with the principle of CBDR, even if we're not necessarily using that specific principle on the treaty itself. Mechanisms that can actually disperse those funds, because sometimes what we're seeing with all these big pledges and funds is that they get pledged and then the transfer of finance doesn't always happen for various reasons. So we need those mechanisms as well. The third is around removing barriers to accessing finance. So one of the examples I was mentioning before was capital costs, and capital costs and interest rates are determined by hedging that the banks do, risk analysis basically, and we need to be able to address that. And a treaty could perhaps have a mechanism that would address that barrier. We need to help countries to diversify their economies, so there can be instruments and mechanisms to support with that. We need to facilitate new forms of trade relationships, and particularly solidarity trading policies that can unlock fairer financing and support economic sovereignty and moving away from this kind of colonial trade regime, which is so problematic for countries across the global south. And finally, of course, transparency arrangements around finance flows. Next slide, please. I won't go into detail on this given the time, but there are ways that you can have hard obligations on states through a treaty, and you can also have soft obligations which enable normative shifts and expectations. We want a mix of both. We've learned from looking at previous treaties that if you don't have the hard obligations, you don't have accountability. But if you don't have the soft obligations, you may not be shifting the wider landscape in terms of other institutions. So we think that that's important. And we also think that what we do together collectively should be supporting political space more broadly around the transition away from fossil fuels and around macroeconomic and climate justice. So what I mean by that is, what we want to do is encourage the states and the civil society we work with to get behind some of those wider, bigger proposals around macroeconomic justice, around climate justice, so that we're part of that movement and we're one contribution within that landscape of solutions. Next slide, please. So I'll just very briefly share what we're working on with regards to debt justice at the moment and how the treaty might be able to support. I mentioned before we're in the 4th debt wave. We've just put a report out with a leading debt expert, Joella Rambaran, his name is, which looks at the situation we're in globally with debt. And the short of a long story that you will all probably know is that debt is escalating. There are 4 times as many countries in debt crisis, or nearly in debt crisis now, than there was a decade ago. And the world's lowest income nations are actually paying out $60 billion in debt servicing alone, which is twice what they're actually receiving in climate finance. So there's a huge imbalance there. And of course, what is driving the debt crisis is also the climate crisis. Next slide, please. So this is based on an unjust international financial architecture. It's the remnants or the continuation of colonial structures, if we're being very honest. And if we look at it very carefully, we can see that 68 developing countries or countries across the global south actually experienced net financial outflows in 2022. So they pay more on debt servicing than they're getting in terms of inflows on public financing. So it's just an escalating crisis. And we want the treaty to be able to offer something to address that. The treaty on its own cannot address the global financial architecture and the unjustness of it, but we can help to move things in a better direction from our space. Next slide, please. So there are different mechanisms that a treaty could have and could facilitate. And again, I want to say that this would be within the wider context of the advocacy for a UN debt convention, because this needs to be addressed at the global structural scale. But what we can do is develop a kind of bridging mechanism. And so we're looking at debt cancellation, debt suspension, debt conversions, all these different ways of that bigger picture. And we're thinking about developing, or we are actually developing, what's called a debt resolution facility, which could be platformed within the treaty. And basically that will help member states or those engaging with the treaty to assess the debt that they have. And then when you assess the debt and you have that support to assess it, you can see this new term called odious debt. So there are debts that are now classed in international law, or increasingly so in international law, that are illegitimate. And there's a case being made around fossil fuel debts and around other forms of unjust debt being illegitimate. And there have been cases where states have refused to pay that illegitimate debt and then it's been cancelled. So we can support with assessing the debt, and then we can support countries with renegotiating some of the debt. Again, we're not going to be able to address all of the debt, but we could help to reduce it a little bit. So we're working quite hard on that, and we're also keen to support the members of the treaty to get behind that wider UN debt resolution advocacy. Next slide, please. Yeah, so just to say, we're doing quite a lot. We're always happy to have feedback and discuss ideas that you might have. So please do get in touch anytime. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amira. We're really grateful you shared all this. I know just transition finance and how do we address debt and ensure the finance is on the table to make our energy transition needs attainable is really on the top of a lot of people's minds. So thank you so much for sharing all the important work you've been leading. I'm now going to turn to Omar El-Mawi from PowerShift Africa. That is one of our leading partner organizations on the continent. Omar is a dedicated Pan-African lawyer who convenes the Africa Movement Building Space, which is a platform pushing for a Pan-African approach towards resolving the continent's problems. And he's dedicated his career towards working with communities and the African people to reject harmful projects like coal in Kenya through the Decolonize campaign and oil extraction in East Africa through the Stop East Africa Crude Oil Pipeline, Stop EACOP. And so Omar is going to share how a fossil fuel treaty initiative can support local fossil fuel resistance and just transition efforts with examples from Kenya. So thank you so much, and over to you, Omar.
Thanks, Seble, and good afternoon, friends and colleagues from Malawi that are joining us today to have this important conversation on the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty and what an endorsement of the same would mean, not just for Malawi, but even for the initiative itself in terms of what we're trying to push. First and foremost, I want to begin by mentioning that it's clear that in Africa, fossil fuels are not necessarily, they're not in any way, shape, or form helping the continent to progress. We've seen it in Nigeria, where despite being the continent's top producer and exporter of fossil fuels, they're still having one of the populations leading when it comes to people living in extreme poverty. You'll also see somewhere like the Niger Delta, a place in Nigeria that has significantly been affected by fossil fuel extraction to an extent where right now the life expectancy of our brothers and sisters at that particular place is just around 40 years. So once you go beyond 40 years, you consider yourself lucky. So these are some of the deficits that you're seeing as far as fossil fuels are concerned. And then the last thing I want to mention as a way of a background is the fact that fossil fuels have been utilized as a way of, in many ways, extracting from the continent. That's why you will see most of the fossil fuel projects that are happening within the continent are for export. It's why you're seeing 100% of the fossil fuel extraction in Nigeria is for export until recently. You'll also see that I think over 80% of the fossil fuel extraction in Angola, in Algeria, and other places are also for export. And it's also partly the reason why you're seeing they're building the world's longest heated crude oil pipeline, 1,400 kilometer long, from another landlocked country like Malawi in Uganda, so that they can get the oil that has been discovered at that point all the way to another country in Tanzania, so that they can export it to the external in the global north at the expense of the people, nature, and climate of this area. So that's something that I felt was going to be important for us to share. And therefore, for me, and if time permits, I'll speak on 5 points, and I'll try and spend less than a minute on each. Hopefully, if anything is unclear or you need me to speak more on, we can interact through the question and feedback session towards the end of the meeting. So first, I really think that part of the reason why this initiative has been good, and I'll be speaking mostly with examples from the context in Kenya, is that it allows us to look at fossil fuels not just from an environmental perspective, but we're looking at it from all the other parameters that it's concerned with. And Seble and Amira spoke intensively around the debt, around the economics, around it, and the different other aspects that it comes with. So that's something that it gives us, and it allows us to speak on issues to do with fossil fuel with a lot of evidence and a lot of way that is very persuasive and convinces people to really see how bad fossil fuels really are. And I think that gives us the argument that is very hard for anyone else to try and prove otherwise. I think it also allows us to have an opportunity to engage not just within the local context, but also bring these conversations into the global platform as well. An example will be the Decolonize campaign, which was a campaign that was pushing to resist exploration and the construction of the first coal plant in Kenya and East Africa. And a big way of how they have been able to, until now, be very successful in this conversation has been because they've looked at fossil fuels not just as a product and just as an environmental issue, but they've looked at it from all the other different parameters, including economics, environment, social, legal, and other aspects that it concerns with. I think it allows us to have that really, really good way of looking at issues. And that's why you'll see they managed to go to court, give testimony that was very, very authoritative and persuasive to an extent where we've convinced judges and people who we believed to be very pro-government, very pro-fossil fuels, but we've actually been able to convince them that actually this is something that is very problematic, to an extent where they've even, through their judgments, mentioned the same. I think the second point that I would like to talk about is how this fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty initiative allows us to also amplify our voices in the global context. The unfortunate thing is when we go to global conversations, most of the time it's the global north. And when I say global north, I don't just mean governments, but even institutions, people, individuals who are based within these geographies normally have more opportunities and more platforms and more voice when it comes to these conversations. And to me, this is the wrong way of approaching it, because we are currently in this conundrum, in this problem, because of the things that they've done, the global north, mostly done by the global north, towards getting us to this climate catastrophe that we're in it today. So I think this initiative allows us that opportunity for us to be leaders and be seen as leaders, because one, I really don't believe that Malawi as much as we're being told it's one of the poorest countries in the world. But when you look at all the other different parameters outside of GDP, it's one of the countries that is very rich on natural resources. You guys are one of the countries that's very culturally rich, and also a lot of social, apologies for that, a lot of social way of living, and how you're friendly and everything else that's good and it's working for you. And therefore, this provides us that opportunity for Malawi, as it is the case for Kenya, to be leaders in this conversation on how to deal with the climate problem. I think the third point that I want to mention is the support aspect that we need on climate. And by support here, it's not just financing, because we need a lot of financing for us to be able to proceed to tackle the climate crisis. But we also need technological transfer. We also need a lot of partnership. And I think this initiative allows us to unlock that in a way that we can actually, during the negotiations, say that for us to be able to proceed, so that we can tap into our lots and lots of potential around renewable energy, wind, solar, geothermal, and hydro, among others. Then part of the conversation can be about how do we get the resources, do we get the knowledge, and also do we get the technology for us to be able to proceed forward, because we have everything we need to tap and be successful and powerful as a continent and as countries individually. All that we are lacking is that technological support that we will get, which is not necessarily a favor that's being given to us, but it can be other partners coming in as partners and supporting, and us being able to tap to the potential that we have. Fourth aspect that and I'll give examples on this one as well around Kenya, is issues around the legal and political backing that we will be seeing with the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative. And in Kenya, thanks to the amazing work that has been done partly by civil society, but also with a lot of support from the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Secretariat, they've been able to move and speak to spouses of elected government officials. So mostly the county governments, we have a devolved government unit in Kenya, where we have 47 counties. So they've been able to contact each of the 47 counties governor spouses, mostly it's the wives, and they've been able to engage and speak to them to get them to support this initiative. And in many, many ways, we're normally told that we have a very known and famous saying here in Kenya, and mostly within the Swahili community, where we are told that if you want something from your father, you speak to your mother, because if you speak to your father, you will never get it. So you need to know how are you able to convince and get things done through utilizing strategy and ways of getting things done. And partly maybe what will deliver this for Kenya, and I hope the same will be for Malawi, will be getting through the spouses of the so-called government representatives. The other bit is that was on the political, but on legal, it's mostly around pushing for not just policy being implemented and being stated, but also we could try different ways of going to court whenever we are seeing bad examples of projects that will be taking us back with what we're trying to do with pushing against fossil fuels. An example in Kenya is Kenya has made a commitment, for instance, that by 2035, our energy electricity grid is going to be 100% powered by renewable energy. And therefore, this will be giving us an opportunity to push even through our courts of saying the government has committed, and therefore we cannot be seeing more and more examples of the same. Now, lastly, another example I would give is being able, and this is something that the treaty, the Fossil Fuel and Profession Treaty, is doing very, very well, is how they're linking fossil fuels to also other parameters of life. So they're not just stopping at the energy aspect, but they're speaking around land rights. and how fossil fuels, for instance, are affecting land rights of people, which is significant for Malawi as well, because 80%, at least I think when I was reading, over 80% of your economy is dependent on agriculture. So what does it mean for these kinds of economies that are really, really dependent on land, as well as also on energy democracies? Because if we're pushing towards fossil fuels, getting to stranded assets, what does it mean for energy democracies and for us as people of this country, this meaning Kenya, and also of the continent? Apologies, I've spoken a little bit longer, but I'll push it back to you, Seble. Hopefully it was helpful, and I'm looking forward to engaging further.
Extremely helpful. Thank you so much, Omar. I think thanks also for shedding light on the export nature of many of the big fossil fuel producers on the continent and the very shortened life expectancies. Areas like the Niger Delta are experiencing as sacrifice zones for the oil industry, oil and gas, and how we need to advocate for this shift away from fossil fuels, not just from a climate perspective, but from our livelihoods, violence, the air we breathe, our human rights. And you made a really important distinction. Our continent is not poor at all. It's incredibly rich. That's why all these corporations are trying to take out of it. And we need to really defend our territories and be able to have sovereign energy sources. So thank you so much for sharing all of the insights from Kenya and across the continent. I'm sorry we're going a bit over time, so I hope folks can stay a bit longer. And also we have so many new people in the room. If you could please introduce yourselves in the chat, where you're joining us from and the organizations you're a part of, that would be great to get to know you better. And now I'm going to turn to Lorraine Chiponda, who has been an activist in the climate justice space for nearly a decade, in many different roles as an activist, as a community rights defender, as a regional climate and energy facilitator, and is now the Africa Network Coordinator at the Global Gas and Oil Network, GGON. And in this role, Lorraine works with a broad spectrum of African civil society organizations and frontline communities, creating a collective and collaborative space of fossil fuel resistance and promoting just transitions towards equitable, feminist, people-powered, renewable energy futures. So Lorraine's going to cover the fossil fuel climate crisis and its impacts from Southern Africa. Lorraine is from Zimbabwe, and the potential for universal energy access and community energy sovereignty with renewable energy that can propel development outcomes, and how a fossil fuel treaty can support this transition. So over to you, Lorraine, and Zoe, if you could share her presentation, that would be wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Seble, and I'll get right into it. It's unfortunate I'm speaking last, and I'm hoping that people will keep pace with my presentation. So first slide, next slide. I'm sure we all know the various impacts that Southern Africa has faced in terms of climate disasters. And just to make it clear and to also elaborate on the exact cause, we know that the climate crisis is mostly caused by expansion of the fossil fuel industry, which particularly, coal, oil, and gas, which are continuously releasing greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere, and resulting in temperature increases and a whole range of climate changes and impacts that are stemming from the fossil fuel industry. And from Southern Africa, we've experienced a lot. And my fear is that we're almost normalizing climate disasters. Just in the past season, you find that we experienced about 7 cyclones, right? Cyclone Chido, Cyclone Dikeledi, Cyclone Becky in the Southern Africa region. And it scares me that, fewer voices are coming out and speaking out against, fossil fuels, especially in relation to the climate disasters that are that we are experiencing in Southern Africa. And of course, despite facing the cyclones, we're still facing a drought because of the El Nino effect, right? And this again translates to multiple impacts. May you please go to the next slide? And this is resulting in a lot of the impacts, particularly on food issues, food security. I hate the word security, so I would say food sovereignty, right? So some of the impacts from the climate crisis are not being mitigated, particularly that we are normalizing it. and all the loss and damage is not being recognized. If you look at Mozambique, right, people are still trying to recover from Cyclone Idai. And again, like I said, we experienced the 7 cyclones again in the last season. So we're still facing the trauma of the previous climate disasters, right? And if you look at the energy system, like I said, much of the climate disasters, a large portion of the climate crisis is attributed towards the proliferation of fossil fuels across the globe. And again, if you look at the energy system in Southern Africa, you see that it has got a lot of structural and systemic challenges, right? And these are undermining energy access. The type of energy system that we have is continuously undermining African livelihoods development, right? And it's again still posing a lot of developmental challenges within Southern Africa. If you look at the picture that is there on the slide, it depicts what is happening in the Mpumalanga province of South Africa, right, where there's continuous emissions from the coal, from the burning of coal, right? And particularly in this region, the World Health Organization stated that it has resulted in, it is one spot across the globe, which is the most polluted area. And because of this pollution, it is attributed to a lot of other diseases, health concerns, such as lung diseases, respiratory issues, right, which have actually increased in the community as a result of continuous burning of fossil fuels. So again, other issues that we're facing, particularly in Southern Africa, is the persistent electricity access gaps and over-reliance on centralized fossil fuel dependent systems, energy systems, right? Even for South Africa, which has got a vast population that has got access to energy, to electricity, they're still inconsistent, and because of the over-reliance on coal and on a centralized grid, and also issues with the coal infrastructure, right? There's still issues with regards to power cuts, load shedding, right? Because of the nature of the fossil fuel industry, which is centralized and dependent on units that are localized in one area, right? So these are some of the issues. And then for other countries in Southern Africa, if you look at Malawi, right, we're still facing energy access issues with only 18% of the entire population, right, accessing energy. So again, this is as a result of over-dependence in the SADC region on fossil fuels. And again, if you look at Zimbabwe, at Mozambique, right, we are still facing a lot of issues with coal dependence. And if you look, I wrote there expansion and export. It's another challenge that we are faced with in the Southern Africa region, where currently, I'm sure you all know, right, because of the fossil fuel expansion that is happening, we're seeing a lot of expansion and export dynamic that is happening in the region, which is resulting still in the persistent energy poverty, still resulting in a whole lot of developmental challenges across the continent, because the energy that is being extracted, particularly fossil fuels, oil and gas, is still heavily dependent on grabbing of commons and also just loss of rights for communities. If you go on to the next slide that I shared, it gives a depiction of what will be happening in the Orange Basin, particularly for South Africa, Namibia, and Botswana, where there is where much of the coastal area, right, has been parceled out to fossil fuel corporations that will be expanding in terms of fossil fuels, especially gas, right? And if this happens, as you can see, it's a region that is ecologically sensitive, mostly desert area, with indigenous communities that are living in this area. Expansion and export of fossil fuels in this region will result in a lot of displacement, right, of communities that live in the area, and also result in other challenges such as water stresses and so forth. Next slide. Again, the slide, this is now Mozambique. As you can see, again, a lot of parceling of land, right? This means communities are going to, lose much of the land, right? So this is what we're seeing from the fossil fuel industry across Southern Africa. A lot of rights issues are coming up: loss of land, loss of livelihoods. Because if you lose access to your land, it means you can then not attain access to your land-based livelihood. And again, various other freedoms in terms of exclusion from commons, as well as potential pollution of coastal areas. Because if you look at this region, again, it is a coastal area, right? It means fisheries are going to be affected. And when fisheries are affected, livelihoods are affected. Nutrition at household level is then affected as well. Next slide. And again, what we are pushing for, as was mentioned, is localized renewable energy systems. And why are we pushing for this? Because Africa, especially Southern Africa, has massive potential to build a robust renewable energy system that can be owned by communities that are living in energy poverty. As was shown in the pictures, fossil fuel infrastructure cannot be decentralized or localized in areas where there's energy poverty because of the nature of how it is structured. It has to be in areas where the gas is, where the oil is, right? And for us to be able to live well with our environment and also ensure energy ownership and energy sovereignty, it means we have to push for renewable energy, particularly solar energy. If you look at hydro, it does pose various other issues, right, within the region, especially its dependence on the climate, right, on water in our rivers. And of course, large hydro projects have also resulted in a plethora of issues. And so some of the solutions, in as much as they might appear to be renewable, still we do not advocate for them because of the massive impact that they might have on communities. But again, evidence shows that Africa as a whole, we do have leadership in terms of solar power, with more than 7 hours of sunlight, depending on the season, if it's summer or not. But we've got 5 to 7 hours of sunlight that can facilitate solar power within our region. Next slide. As I said that much of the impacts from the fossil industry, right, the high cost of disasters, right, as they fuel the energy crisis. And when there is disaster, it means our economies are affected, and not just national economies, but even household economies as well. I've mentioned the issue of food and agriculture as well. And just to give an example of Malawi, which has got 80% of the population still employed within the agriculture sector, and much of the population, they do actually earn their livelihoods as smallholder farmers, right? So further investment in the fossil fuels, right, it continuously undermines efforts to transition towards renewable energy, and then worsens the climate disasters as well. Next slide. I've mentioned the issue on renewable energy, and I've mentioned why we are pushing for renewable energy. Our capacity within Africa, within Southern Africa, to actually employ renewable energy, including the massive inputs that we offer, such as our sunlight, even geothermal in areas such as Mozambique and even Malawi, right? And also just youthful populations that are able to actually be employed within the renewable energy sector. So we do are able to actually position ourselves and provide leadership, right? And why we are pushing for the treaty as well. First, like I said, the treaty does talk about transforming energy systems and also provides remedies, right? It talks about energy equity and also energy justice, right? And so, next slide. And so when we're pushing for the treaty as well, these are some of the tenets that you are pushing for. I put this picture because I'm presenting in the last, I'm the last person to present, and I put this picture so that we can carefully analyze it and see, what our future could look like and what is wrong with this future as well. So this future appears to be pushing for renewable clean energy system, but if you look closely at it, it is not the future that we want, right? So the fossil fuel treaty has got the potential to change and transform energy politics, right? It has the potential to push for the tenets around energy that we want, that is people-owned energy, energy sovereignty, right? So like I said, this is being pushed by the SADC region, right? These are their projections with regards to renewable energy on the continent. And within this, they're also placing gas as a potential to actually increase energy access. But we know that still gas poses various threats. It still has got multiple issues in terms of land grabs, in terms of still, contributing towards the emissions that will result in the climate crisis. So again, in terms of the solutions that we're pushing for, we still need to carefully ensure that we do not push for false solutions. We do not push for techno fixes on the continent as well. Next slide. So again, like I was saying, the future that is offered by the treaty and how the treaty can be embraced to ensure that it pushes our agenda, a Pan-African agenda, an agenda that speaks to community ownership. First, the treaty is pushing for a rapid phase out, particularly from rich nations. When this is done, it means finance is freed up, right? And we're able to redirect finance from the fossil fuel industry towards renewable energy. And when this is done, it means that we'll be able to actually, provide energy, finance from within our institutions, including the Africa Development Bank, including our localized institutions that are able to actually provide the financing. So we need to actually free up finance, push for our financial institutions to redirect finance from fossil fuels to clean energy. And again, the call for urgent phase out, something that we need. Like I mentioned, just in this season, we experienced 7 cyclones just in the past season. And if we do not urgently push for phase out, it means we're going to continuously experience climate disasters. We're going to continuously face loss and damage. We're still going to cripple our local economies, our national economies because of the climate disasters when we fail to recover. So again, that the treaty is pushing for urgent phase out is something that we all need to embrace because of our experiences within the SADC region. And again, the treaty offers an opportunity to redefine what development is, right? To redefine energy politics. Like I mentioned earlier on, that when we hear statements from our African leaders and from the projections by the SADC region that they are trying to define fossil fuels as something that Africa needs. And yet, like I mentioned above, the fossil fuel industry is based on the idea that Africa is a region where extraction can happen. We face the impacts and then the energy itself is taken out of the continent. So we need to so the treaty offers an opportunity for us to redefine what development can look like, what energy justice can look like. We have this opportunity to envision energy justice for our communities and for ourselves, and also just redefine what security means, what energy sovereignty means, and where we can place ourselves within the transition that is happening already. So this is where I'm going to end, and thank you. I was very short because of the time that we have, so I'm handing back to you, Seble.
Thank you so much, Lorraine. That was super powerful, and especially your opening line around the fear that we're normalizing climate disaster. So I think thank you for just bringing back the emotion and the lived reality of the consequences of this industry and how it really undermines energy access for our continent while driving a lot of disaster, and the potential we have for localized renewable energy solutions, community ownership, Pan-African models of redefining what development looks like and moving away from the sacrifice zone mentality to really envisioning energy justice for our communities, as you said. So thank you so much. We still have 3 more speakers, so please stick around to hear. And I think there are some questions in the chat. Julius, one of them is for you from Rex Mula. If you just want to respond in the chat, it says, Julius, that was incredible, but why do you think in your own experience climate financing is a problem between developing and developed? If you want to respond to Rex's question in the chat, that would be great. And now I'm going to turn to Charles Mkoka, who is a dedicated Malawian environmental and natural resources management expert with extensive practical experience in climate change, energy, and resilience building. He has a strong background in development communication and has spent decades advocating for sustainable environmental governance and community-based conservation. He's currently the executive director of CURE, the Coordination Union for the Rehabilitation of the Environment, which is a network lead NGO and think tank leading efforts to enhance environmental sustainability and improve livelihoods across Malawi. And at CURE, Charles continues to champion ecosystem restoration, sustainable livelihoods, and evidence-based policymaking, ensuring that communities play a central role in managing and preserving Malawi's natural resources. So Charles is going to speak about the ongoing leadership and momentum on the fossil fuel treaty in Malawi, including with civil society and subnational support, as well as high-level government engagement and with the media. So that's over to you now, Charles. Thanks so much.
Okay, thank you very much, Seble. But also, just to extend my thanks to, I think, the rest of the participants that are taking part in this webinar. I see some key names within the civil society space in Malawi. I think from the key participating institutions. I think from Mzuzu, I've seen Paul Mvula, I've seen Mr. Crossway. I've also seen a couple of colleagues from the Civil Society Network, which is really great, and we are really thankful to that. So I will not be making a presentation per se, but I will just be reading from something that has actually been going in as far as the issues related to the fossil fuel treaty is concerned, but also the efforts that have actually been made so far towards the issues related to just energy transition in Malawi. As one of the countries, Malawi is one of the countries that is most vulnerable to climate change, and also chair of the least developed countries in Malawi. We all know too well the effects of climate crisis on our communities, our homes, our infrastructure, our economy, and our loved ones, and our future. Like many developing countries, we contribute negligibly to global greenhouse gas emission, but are disproportionately affected by escalating climate impacts. Over the past decades, our country has experienced more than 8 major flooding events and 7 droughts, extreme weather events that are primarily attributed to global extraction and expansion of fossil fuels, such as coal, oil, and gas, which are responsible for nearly 90% of all carbon emissions released in the last decades. This has exacerbated environmental degradation, destruction of infrastructure, fueled food insecurity, loss of life and livelihoods, and widespread displacement, harming vulnerable populations the most, while failing to enrich and power our communities. This is why it is essential that we explore the opportunities for a fair, financed, and people-centered transition to sustainable energy solutions to protect the future of our communities. As mentioned by Seble and the rest of the other speakers that have spoken before, the Fossil Fuel and Non-Proliferation Treaty proposal, which we are here to learn more about today, is a proposed global mechanism that offers a framework aimed at fostering international cooperation for a fair, well-planned, and financed transition away from fossil fuels. It calls for an end to fossil fuel expansion. It calls for a fair end out of the fossil fuels, where wealthy nations with the capacity and historical responsibility for emission transition practice, providing support to others around the world. It also calls for a just and equitable transition, ensuring that workers, communities, and industries are supported as we shift to renewable energy. The board proposal for a legally binding fossil fuel treaty is a key mechanism for securing the financial and technical support that countries like ours need to transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy. Our nation has already enacted progressive climate policies and legislations to create a sustainable and resilient energy landscape powered by renewables that benefit all of our people, especially those mostly affected by climate change. In addition, our capital, Lilongwe, and the city of Mzuzu have already endorsed the call for a treaty, aligning themselves with the global climate ambitions while ensuring our communities are supported throughout the transition to cleaner energy. On top of that, the Malawi media has actually also been engaged to appraise them about the treaty itself, and these efforts were actually made in August last year. At the national level, the Coordination Union for Rehabilitation of the Environment, CURE, in conjunction with the treaty, held a high-level convening dialogue in February, bringing together policymakers, experts, and the civil society in Lilongwe to explore the proposal for the Fossil Fuel and Non-Proliferation Treaty and its role in the global just transition to an equitable energy to an equitable renewable future. The dialogue highlighted Malawi's unique challenges and opportunities and how international cooperation can drive an equitable transition. We are optimistic that the engagement we are having at different levels will contribute to the necessary impetus for the advancement of a fossil fuel treaty. It is imperative that African nations have a place at the table to allow for an inclusive process for setting the terms and provisions of a treaty that puts the needs of our vulnerable communities first. We hope that Malawi can be one of the first mover African countries that will join the 16 nation states engaging in a discussion on a treaty. As we continue to transform our nation into an economically vibrant and environmentally conscious nation, we look forward to a future where clean energy powers our homes, it powers our businesses and communities, and where no one is left behind. Together, we will rise to meet the challenges of climate change and build a resilient and prosperous future for all. As I wrap up, I would like to thank all the colleagues, the partners, and all stakeholders for their participation and support, as it is through collective action that we can bring about lasting change in as far as the energy sector is concerned. This is all I had, and I would just like to thank everybody that is here, but also the various partners that spared their time to take part in this webinar. I think we have very key representatives from most of the players within Malawi. The top management is here. I just wanted to thank you, but also to thank the rest of the various other partners and participants. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Charles, and thank you for your leadership on the campaign in Malawi, and also for making this happen today. We've been, so inspired by all the momentum. And thank you everyone for sticking around these few extra minutes longer. We really appreciate it, and sorry for going over time. We will now turn to Matthews Malata, who is a passionate nature enthusiast and Malawi 2063 Environmental Sustainability Champion, recognized by the government of Malawi through the National Planning Commission. With a passion for environmental sustainability, Matthews has made significant contributions to Malawi's climate change and environmental landscape through awareness, campaigns, policy development, and implementation. So Matthews will explain why global fossil fuel phase out is critical for climate resilience in Malawi, a country that faces the injustice of a climate crisis that it did not cause, and why international cooperation is essential to catalyze a just transition. So thank you so much, Matthews, and over to you.
All right, many thanks indeed, Sebo, for the introduction, and also thanks everyone for joining. I thought I could just say, now this is the end of the webinar, and we can take questions. I think a lot has been addressed by my colleagues, and I'm sure the participants also would like to ask as many questions as they can, and therefore I'll try to be very quick. I will not focus on all the things that I wanted to talk about, but just to take you back home. I think we have heard a lot of things from policy perspective, research perspective and things like that, which is very, very important. But what I want to simply emphasize on is that for sure, I think we need this just transition today. Maybe we are late, we needed it yesterday. But it is important that we're having these conversations. And also at the onset, I would like to indicate that I think there are so many people who are getting less interested in these kind of conversations, especially when they are not giving us the results that we want. And it's the same thing with the kind of treaties that we are pushing forward now. I think we have come up with so many agreements, so I'd say, And probably what we need now going forward is more accountability. We have failed to follow through things that could have really helped all of us and liberate all of us from the climate catastrophe that we are all experiencing now. And it is pretty much a very disappointing situation. Now, what I want to emphasize on is that from Malawi point of view, when you're talking about climate resilience, basically we are talking about people as well as the existing systems. And in the Malawi context, as it was already highlighted by Herbert and Julius also, I will simplify things by saying that when you're talking about a just transition, when you're talking about a climate resilient Malawi, all that means is that we have a very good number of people that have got access to clean energy. And at the same time, we're also looking at people who can be able to cook sustainably, getting energy from sustainable sources, but also being in a position to use energy efficient technologies or cookstoves, if you want, which at the moment are very difficult to get. And if they are available, sometimes they are not available in the last mile places where they can be found by everyone, they can be used by everyone. And in some cases, if they are available, it means the cost is very high. Not so many people are able to afford to purchase, these energy efficient cookstoves, for example. Yet, globally, we are talking about maybe doubling or tripling, access to clean energy and things like that. It means we have got two different varying situations here, and the gap is just so huge. And therefore, we really need to work hard in terms of bridging this gap. On the other hand, the clean energy for lighting and cooking aside, I think if we do a good job, to us, if we win on this agenda, what it means is that honestly we'll reduce our stress in as far as fuel importations are concerned. As I speak now, we have very long fuel queues in Malawi. It's hard to get fuel, for example. What are the alternatives that we're talking about? Yes, we've been talking about EVs, but EVs, they have got their own shortfalls, but there's still like an opportunity. There's a lot of technology attached to these EVs. For example, you're talking about having all the charging stations in place, the cost of the batteries, but also there is debate in terms of how all these things are produced or manufactured. And how do we make sure that we are creating an environment that could really facilitate the just transition that we're talking about? So already the issue of financial support there is coming out, but also the issue of technological support is coming out. And the Paris Agreement, which colleagues have talked about already, is very clear in terms of who is supposed to take lead in providing support to countries like Malawi, to the LDCs. It is the developed countries. Unfortunately and sadly, they have not been accountable enough. They keep on changing goalposts, and that's why much as we need to commit to all these issues that we're talking about today, but most importantly is to see all these developed countries being a little bit, more accountable to the things which they usually commit, but also at the same time they move away like in a twinkle of an eye. I'll talk about, for example, how we built momentum around the issue of, phasing down fossil fuels. That was in Dubai. The momentum was so high. The global stocktake outcomes are also very clear in terms of the direction that we need to take. But come Dubai, rather Azerbaijan, which is COP29, the tone was different. Almost all the big guys we're working towards frustrating this agenda. Nothing concrete came out of COP29. The issue of phasing out the fossil fuels was completely suppressed. We can only hope that Belém, Brazil, is going to resuscitate this agenda. But unfortunately, there's still a lot more work that needs to be done. And these are the things which do really put countries like Malawi in a very difficult position, because for us, climate resilience means that our people should still be able to have access to energy to keep, businesses afloat. And this is why also governments have been put in a fix. I'll talk about the Kamwamba coal power-fired project, which the government still insists is something that they will do. It is still on the agenda because they feel like the energy poverty is still high in Malawi. They need to do it. And that is one of the options. And to facilitate the removal of this option from the government's agenda, it means we need concrete commitment from the global north and other partners, but also other innovative financing solutions, so that we can maintain our green path and really refrain from going for the projects like the Kamwamba, which I talked about, without which it will be very difficult to convince politicians or indeed anyone high up there to listen to what we are saying, because the need is just so huge on the ground. People are suffering. The devastation is very high, and there is always that, desperation to have, for example, more companies coming up with their investments in Malawi. And to attract investors, you need a very strong base in as far as power generation is concerned. Indeed, Malawi can also benefit, that aside, from other, ventures that could come with the transition that we're talking about today. There are opportunities that we can create green jobs. Most young people are unemployed, and the just transition could really create multiple jobs, contrary to the fears that are usually there to say when you're transitioning, it also means that people lose jobs and stuff like that. But I think there are so many studies that have indicated that green jobs are real. They have been created elsewhere. We have created some of them in Malawi, and I think we can also build on this. And there is an opportunity also to expand some of the innovations that are already existing, and also building on AI technologies, for example, to do more and leverage on that to ensure there is efficiency, but also quality in terms of delivery. There are also opportunities like boosting, capital base, but also returns for small and medium enterprises that could be involved in, it could be solar businesses, supply of, potable irrigation, pumps to our local farmers. All these are things that we're doing them, but I think there is room that we can do better, but also we can expand. Having talked about the fuel crisis and stuff like that, let me connect that to the issue of the debt stress that someone also referred to earlier in this meeting. I think we're a culprit. I think we are borrowing just to buy or import fuels, and that is not a very good situation for us. Almost all our forex reserves are being depleted just to indeed import fuel, petrol, diesel, and gas, for example. And that is a big issue for Malawi. And I hope if there is a way out, which we are trying to pursue now, that could really save our economy big time, and also invest in other productive industries using clean energy sources in line with the SDGs that we have, SDG 7 and others, but also the Malawi 2063 vision that we have. The second question was really all about why international cooperation is very important. And I think most of the things have been addressed by my colleagues, but I'll just run through them very quickly. Having consensus that this is a global issue, obviously it cannot be addressed by Malawi alone. This is why there is continuous need for sharing knowledge, for sharing expertise, but also resources. This is why we need to be on top of our game in making sure that this multilateralism process is working. but also we are still pushing for international cooperation. I already referred to the issue of technology transfer. I think that's also why we need strong international cooperation, not only strong, but also sustained, because that's why we have got challenges in order for us to saturate some of these working technologies in our countries, and including Malawi. I talked about financial support. All these things are very important for all of us. And I think this is why I feel like we need to be pushing for this. It is really, it can happen. Models are there. But I think I've already talked about some of the potential barriers, which we also need to zero in and discuss and make sure that we're able to have a clear pathway in terms of how best we can approach this issue, so that by the end of the day, it's not just about us talking about these things, but it's also about making those that are responsible for polluting the planet a bit more accountable, but also delivering on their commitments. So issues of finance, capacity building, technology transfer, they are very key and fundamental. Malawi is pretty much ready. And I think we are a very good example already, because almost like 99% of our electricity is clean. And we have committed ourselves many times through like so many instruments that are already there. But we feel like, I think we are let down. This is why we need to come out strong. We need to continuously talk about these things. We shouldn't give up. But I think, let me congratulate you on the work that you're doing. Let's mobilize more people. Let's be more strategic, get the right voices, the right governments and people on board, so that we can win on this agenda. So let me stop there for now, and thank you indeed for creating this opportunity and also for inviting me to speak on this topic. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Matthews, for sharing what this means on the ground and climate resilience as the need for people to have access to electricity and really energy access as a right, and the importance and necessity of financing for this transition to be possible, and also all the opportunities that come with it in terms of green job creation. Much more jobs are created with every dollar invested in renewable energy, and how kind of the issues of debt are really creating much difficulty in the country, with a lot of it being depleted, the finances being depleted around fuel imports, and how this situation can change if really we tap into the potential of renewable energy that's so abundant in Malawi and across the continent. So thank you so much for sharing. I want to go to our last speaker, who is Violet Mfunebanda, an environmental management expert with over 10 years of experience in climate change adaptation and environmental protection. She holds a BSc in environmental science and technology and is an active member of both the Green Girls Platform and the National Youth Network on Climate Change in Malawi. Violet advocates for a just transition away from fossil fuels and emphasizes the importance of renewable energy in driving sustainable socioeconomic growth. Her current focus is on strategic investment that supports climate resilience and green development. She is a vocal proponent of global initiatives such as the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty and recognizing the role in securing a sustainable future for all. So Violet will be our last speaker. And in the meantime, if you have any questions for any of the speakers, please put them in the chat. And now I'm going to turn to Violet, who will speak to the gendered impacts of the climate crisis in Malawi and youth activism for climate justice. So thank you so much, Violet, for being here, for your patience, and now we pass to you. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you so much, Seble. I'm very enthusiastic about all of this, the treaty. Firstly, because let's just state the obvious. I think women and young people have suffered a lot because of climate change. And I think Lorraine echoed so much on what I wanted to mention on the energy poverty that is actually existent, and also the various climate change impacts. So I will not focus too much on that, just to highlight there has been evidence of increased climate change or weather-related impacts, weather-related events, extreme weather-related events such as droughts and floods and the obvious cyclones. And this has obviously affected the women and youth. So the major thing that I wanted to emphasize is not only about the food security, which is firstly one of the most critical and one of the most stated right which is affected, but also there's so many other rights that have been affected over the years because of climate change. So the simplest also is water access. We've also had a lot of gender inequalities that have come because of climate change. We've also had a lot of limited access to education because of climate change, because one of the critical things that happen in Malawi, especially during cyclones or other extreme weather events, is that schools are closed down, and even when they're not, there's a lot of shelter being sought after within school infrastructure. So, like I said, I don't want to emphasize too much on those effects, but I wanted to highlight that I think I support so much the treaty because I see that it's focused more on the just transition away from fossil fuels, recognizing that each country has different economic and social contexts. The same way, I was thinking about it to say, the same way the UN looks at the UN climate change looks at the data and takes into account all of these issues based on countries' economic aspirations, national circumstances. At the end of the day, the just transition is also apologies, we just have a blackout, and I think this proves the need for the transition and highlights my point on energy poverty. Okay, so the just transition is focused on ensuring that each country has a just transition, which means for Malawi, there's need for financial assistance, because the truth is Malawi can't transition entirely without any external support. And this external support, as everyone else has already alluded to, doesn't need to come in form of debt, because we can't add more debt on Malawi's balance sheet. That's a fact. Because I don't want to take too much time, I wanted to also just highlight the fact that women and youth everywhere in the world generally need to be empowered and have understanding of what actually all of this means and what it looks like, and what 10 years and 20 years from now looks like for them if the just transition is not happening the way it should. There's something that Matthews has highlighted on the economic benefits of a just transition, and I wanted to also just mention that the International Renewable Energy Agency has a global renewables outlook, and according to its data, it says the renewable energy sector could create up to 24 million jobs globally by 2030. And I don't think that there's any country in the world right now that does not want to create any more jobs and does not want to improve their economies in that sense. I think data like this is what we need to share widely among everyone who is an advocate, everyone who is an activist in the sector. So again, I don't want to take a lot of time, but one thing that attracted me about the treaty is that right now and I think someone also alluded to it, I think it was Omar, we have the opportunity to, as communities, individuals, organizations, governments, we have the opportunity to join the treaty while it is still being defined. And that means that we get to be part of the processes of defining and deciding what the clauses and the clear expectations of all the stakeholders are going to be. And this is where I feel that young people need to be engaged more, because they have a point of view that is beyond the next 5 years, beyond the next 10 years. So sustainable development is something that is already being discussed within young people. And even in whatever space any young person is right now, even if they're not an environmental management practitioner, but they know enough to know that our actions, our decisions need to be sustainable. So that point of view, I feel that it's what we need to be part of the treaty while we can make our voice count. Because at the end of the day, 20 years from now, the treaty is going to have, let's say, everyone, and then we will not have been part. If we don't take action now, if we don't take, if we're not committed now, and if we're not being part of the process of defining and deciding the clauses, I feel that 20 years from now, we might not have the same space. The same way any global platform right now is defined and decided, and all of the major decisions come from the global north. And that's where I think that this is an opportunity for the global south and for young people to be engaged. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Violet, for your intervention in the middle of a blackout. We appreciate you taking the time and the resilience and bringing it down to the ground of what, the impacts of climate disasters have meant in terms of so many social aspects of who bears the burden, what kind of opportunities are taken away, and how can we actually build a transition that's not creating more financial issues, creating more debt, and actually creating jobs for people and being able to shape the terms of what this future can look like. So thank you so much. I'm sorry we're still massively over time, but we wanted to open up the space for any questions that folks may have. I see there's a couple in the chat that Julius was able to respond to. Are there any folks that have questions right now? You can raise your hand, or you can just share your question directly in the chat if you have them, and just let us know which speaker your question is directed to. That would be helpful. Okay, I'm not seeing any hands up, and I think the questions that were in the chat around climate finance have been responded to, and it's great to hear from students and media that the session has been really insightful. If you do have questions that come up, you can definitely reach out to us, and we can share our emails in the chat, and we'll share the recording for everybody who did attend, so you can listen again and share with other folks. I want to give a really massive thank you to CISONECC and CURE and Trócaire for organizing this virtual deep dive together on the fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty for Malawi. And I want to thank all of our incredible panelists, Herbert, Julius, Matthews, Violet, Charles, Amira, Omar, and Lorraine. A huge thank you to our tech support from Zoe for holding us all together, and a massive thank you to all of you for joining us. As I was mentioning in my presentation, there are many different ways that you can get involved in the campaign for a fossil fuel treaty. So you can endorse the campaign for a fossil fuel treaty as an organization or an individual, and it's directly here on the fossilfueltreaty.org, and you can scroll down to the icon to endorse as an organization or as an individual. And we can then add you to the newsletter and the Africa listserv to share updates. And if you're interested in launching a campaign to target a city and call on them to endorse the fossil fuel treaty, as some have done in Malawi with Lilongwe and Mzuzu, then you can reach out to me. I'll put my email in the chat, and I'll also be the one that shares the recording with you. Or you can also reach out to Lucas, who is our Cities and Subnational Campaign Coordinator. I'll put the contact here. And you can explore the different resources that we have for cities' engagement on the fossil fuel treaty here with these resources, fossilfueltreaty.org/cities. And if you want to engage with parliamentarians, there's more than 1,000 from 96 countries that have supported the call for a fossil-free future. It's one of our sister initiatives. Then this is the link to go to, and I can also share that in the follow-up email. I've seen a question in the chat around what are the plans for progressing with the work in Malawi. So here we wanted to really kind of grow the civil society engagement, understanding, and momentum around what the proposal is. As I've said, there's over 4,000 kind of organizations and institutions around the world who have supported the call for a fossil fuel treaty, so they're part of that network. So we invite organizations across Malawi who are interested in this to endorse and join our network. We have calls every month for the Africa coordination that folks can join in a WhatsApp group if you would like to be a part of that. We're going to be having a senior officials meeting next month on the fossil fuel treaty proposal in Bonn, the UN climate conference, and we would love for Malawi to attend as observers for this. And we hope to do some more briefings for the Environmental Affairs Department, for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and also for the Ministry of Energy, so they can learn more about the initiatives and kind of build on the previous engagement. And we do hope that one day Malawi can become one of the participating nations in developing a fossil fuel treaty. And we'll also be pitching some different op-eds and stories for media on the need for the proposal for Malawi and climate vulnerable nations. So this is how it's going so far. We want to thank you all so much for participating in this session. We're really grateful. We're going to share the recording with you. We can share the presentations. I think there was some requests for that. And we really look forward to staying connected with all of you and building momentum together for Malawi to join the block of nations that are participating in discussions to make the fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty a reality. So thank you so much again to all of you for attending. Thank you, CURE, CISONECC, and Trócaire for putting this together. And thank you again to all of our speakers. Thank you so much for being here. And we hope you all enjoyed and learned a lot. Thanks so much.
Yes, I believe.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Well done, everybody. Well done.
Thank you.